And one will have to deal with those issues, the deeper habits and tendencies and patterns of thinking and feeling sooner or later. So in the direct approach, the so-called shadow work, the so-called realignment of the habits of thinking and feeling with our enlightened understanding tends to take place after this recognition, whereas in the progressive path, it takes place before. Now, in practice, it takes place a little bit before, and it continues to take place afterwards.
We also mentioned, or you were talking about how humans can become aware, and I asked if animals were
Yeah,
naturally aware of their
yeah.
own awareness.
Okay, this is well. So the first question you asked me, I think, was were animals aware?
Let me
Not
explain why I want to know, because that may help contextualize the question. I'm curious if this state of being aware of one's awareness or being aware of one's connectedness to all, that this is all one vellum, like I say, or you say, sorry, or non dualism says, sorry, is that a natural tendency? And if it is so natural, why does it arise everywhere, pretty much globally, that we're separate?
okay.
Like, how
Okay,
does
there's a
that come
lot.
about? Why
There's
why
a
is the mind,
lot.
why is the infinite consciousness frustrating itself? Is it not frustrating
All
itself
right.
with animals?
Okay, but that's another question.
Okay.
Let's come to that in a minute, Kurt.
Okay.
Let's deal with the issue as to whether animals are aware, and then the second question, whether animals are aware of being aware. So if we start, if we respond to this question, are animals aware, from the conventional point of view, namely that we as human beings are aware, then it is reasonable to say, yes, animals are aware. We know that if we tread on our dog or cat's tail, the cat, the dog or the cat screeches in pain, and it's safe for us to conclude that they screech with pain because they feel the pain. They are aware of it. So we can, for the same reason that we screech with pain if somebody treads on our toe. So we conclude from this that the animal is aware. The reason we say the animal is aware is because we feel that we as a human being are aware. Now, on the surface of it, this all makes sense. And then as we go from animals, and dogs and cats are aware, chickens and fishes are aware, and we go down and down and down and down until we get to a line where we think, okay, now past this line, nothing is aware. Possibly plants, trees. There's some discussion about that. Stones are not aware. Pavements, cars, computers are not aware, etc. So there is this line: human beings are aware, dogs and cats, chickens and fish, and then suddenly, from there on, the object or entity is not aware. This is the conventional point of view, and it's based on a presumption, an uninspected presumption that we all take so for granted that we don't really question it. Namely, that we as human beings are aware, or that we have awareness. In other words, that awareness is an attribute of us as a human being. And this definition has found its way into philosophy of mind circles. It's been enshrined in philosophy of mind circles by an American philosopher, I think Thomas Nagel, I think in the 70s, I believe, who defined, who enshrined this understanding in a definition of consciousness that is really used in many philosophy of mind circles as a sort of standard definition of consciousness. And his definition, I'm not quoting verbatim, but I'm paraphrasing. I mean, goes something like this: an entity can be considered to be aware, or to be conscious, or to have conscious experiences or states, if and only if there is something it is like to be that entity, if there is something it is like for that entity. And the famous example: if there is something it is like to be a bat, then we can conclude that bats are conscious or have consciousness. And if there is no experience that corresponds to the statement, I am a table, then we can conclude that tables are not conscious, because no table has the experience of being itself. So this is used as a standard definition of consciousness in philosophy of mind circles, and it is based on an assumption, which I would suggest is a mistake. The assumption is, I, as a human being, know myself as a human being, and that is my proof of being conscious, because I have the experience of being myself as a human being. In other words, I, a human being, am aware of myself. That's the fundamental mistake. A human being is not conscious. A dog or a cat is not conscious. A chicken or a fish is not conscious. A bat is not conscious. Only consciousness is conscious. Only awareness is aware. Therefore, the only entity, if we can call it an entity, that has the experience of being itself is consciousness. There is only something it is like to be consciousness.
Would you disagree with Descartes' I think, therefore I am? Because a thought is fleeting, and you would say you shouldn't take that as evidence that you are?
I think Descartes gets a bad rap in non-dual circles because people tend to think that he meant literally, I have thoughts, therefore I am conscious. That is not what he meant. I think that what he meant is I have conscious experience, therefore I am conscious. He didn't literally mean because I have thoughts, therefore I must be conscious. I think we can credit Descartes with more intelligence than that. He was obviously a highly intelligent man, and it's quite obvious that there is a gap between two thoughts. If there were no gap between two thoughts, they would not be two thoughts. They would be one thought. There are gaps between the words in any one thought. If there were no gap, each thought would consist of one word. In these gaps between thoughts, we are not thinking, but we are obviously still conscious. So, and obviously Descartes understood this. So I think we must credit, I think it's not fair to Descartes to suggest that he literally thought, but it is only because we have thoughts that we are conscious, because dogs and cats would not be conscious. They would not be able to feel pain when you trod on their tail if the definition of consciousness was an entity that has thoughts. So going back to this, what I consider to be a mistake, the fundamental assumption, it is I as a human being that am conscious or have consciousness, and that has given rise to so much misunderstanding about consciousness in the philosophy of mind circles. It is only awareness is aware, only consciousness is conscious, and therefore only consciousness has the experience of being myself. Only consciousness has the knowledge of its own being. And each of us as human beings, we have the experience of being. But when I say we have the experience of being, it is not we as a human being. It is not we, a collection of thoughts, images, feelings, sensations, and perceptions that has the experience of being. It is consciousness in us. No, it's actually not in us, but it is the conscious element of our experience that has the experience of being itself. The mistake we make as human beings is add a quality to the pure experience of being aware of our being. The simple awareness of being is expressed in the phrase simply I am. Everybody has the experience I am. That phrase refers to our essential irreducible self or being, pure consciousness. It is only when we allow the I am to be qualified by experience that we become I am this or I am that. And that is the separate self or the ego, an apparent qualification of our essential irreducible self or being, namely pure consciousness.
I want to thank you so much for speaking with me. And again, I apologize for any ineptitude on my part as a podcaster for interrupting you so often.
Please, Kurt, there's no need for apology. I enjoyed our conversation a couple of days ago very much indeed, and the conversation flows very easily. As I said then, you have a very nice way of asking very pertinent questions, and the conversation flows very easily with it. So please, no, and feel free to interrupt me as well.
Okay, thank you, sir. This one comes from DIY. Actually, I have this one. It sounds like non-dualism is what's echoed in the Vedic texts. And what I'm wondering is, why is it that the East, and which means that it's right in some way, it sounds like the East got it right earlier, in fact, at all, compared to the West, which is extremely dualistic, at least seemingly so, with the Old Testament and the New Testament, and even Islamic texts. How do we account for this? How come one set of people were so much closer to the truth?
I don't think one set of people were closer to the truth. Awareness is the essential nature of everybody. The Christians, the Hindus, the Muslims, the atheists, the saints, the sinners, the aboriginals, everyone. It's true that in India, this tradition of investigation, this science of the mind, goes back at least 3,000 years. In fact, longer. But the same was true in the West. If you read Parmenides, considered to be the founding father of Western philosophy, who predates Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, and then if fast forward a few centuries, you read Plotinus, Meister Eckhart, Jacob Boehme, William Blake. I mean, all through the history of Western thought, this understanding, I'm just mentioning a few, there are so many more, you find this understanding. But I think due to the advent of Christianity, in the West, we were far less tolerant of this investigation into the nature of the mind. The spiritual tradition was appropriated by the state, and a lot of this kind of investigation was suppressed. So it's not that people in the West didn't have this recognition. It was that this kind of investigation was not able to flourish as freely in the West as it was in the East, and it went therefore underground in the West. But it's not an understanding that belongs to the East or comes from the East. It's universal. It's the perennial philosophy. It's the philosophy that is true. Because truth, if there is something called the absolute truth, then it must be absolutely true for all people at all times, under all circumstances. It can have nothing to do with East, West, beliefs, traditions, religions. Most of these traditions, although they originated from an insight into the nature of reality, they were later misunderstood and appropriated by usually by the state. And the original understanding was then either distorted and perverted or simply lost. But you find this understanding really at the heart of all the great religious and spiritual traditions. And in fact, the extent to which one understands one's true nature is a measure of the extent to which one can read the scriptures of the world and find in very different formulations the same understanding. I've gone back sometimes to the I was brought up a Christian, and I was in boarding school for years. We used to sing all the hymns and psalms. I know many of them off by heart simply because we sang them so often. When I go back to them now, I'm so touched by them. The language of the psalms, once you can interpret them in a non-dual way, or even though they may be conceived in dualistic terms, this was just a poetic device. But if you really interpret them from a non-dual perspective, that they are exquisitely beautiful. And you find this in all, if you reread, I won't say all, but a lot of the great religious and spiritual texts, they are all suffused with this understanding, and of course express it in very different ways according to the time and the place in which they were formulated.
Are you able to give an example of a non-dualist interpretation of something from Christianity? For example, Jesus' death or one of his miracles?
I could say something about the parable of the prodigal son.
Please do.
Which can be interpreted in a kind of moralistic way about a young man just taking advantage of his father's inheritance and just leaving home and leading a completely self-indulgent, decadent existence and becoming destitute and then going back home to... But this is, of course, not the meaning of the parable at all. I would suggest that the father in this parable represents infinite consciousness, and the son represents the localization of infinite consciousness, namely each of our finite minds. So just as the son proceeds from the father as an emanation of the father, a kind of a smaller version of the father, so likewise each of our finite minds emanates from infinite consciousness, within infinite consciousness, as a microcosm of infinite consciousness. And the finite mind, once it has contracted out of infinite consciousness into a separate self, it seems to become something temporary and finite. And being temporary and finite, it feels that it is incomplete, that it lacks something. And the entire life of the separate self or ego is characterized by its desire to complete itself or fulfill itself. And to that end, all separate selves go out into the world on a great journey in search of objects, substances, activities, relationships, for the sole purpose of bringing to an end the sense of lack that it feels in its heart. In fact, the separate self doesn't really want the object, the substance, the relationship, or so on. It only wants such an object in order that it will bring its sense of lack to an end, and as such bring it to peace or happiness. But the separate self doesn't realize this. It believes that what it really seeks is the object, the substance, the activity, the relationship. And this is expressed in the parable as the prodigal son going out into the world, having every kind of experience in search of fulfillment, but nothing fulfills it. And eventually it gets to the end of the possibilities of exploring happiness in objective experience, symbolized in the parable by the eating of the pigs, the swine's food. It's desperate. It's tried everything. Its search for happiness in objective experience has come to an end. There's nothing else in objective experience that it can in which it can search for happiness. And as a result, there is this spontaneous turning around. This prodigal son turns around to face the father. This is the turning around of the mind that is normally directed towards the objective content of experience, turns round and faces its source, the presence of awareness from which it originally emanated. And this is symbolized as in the Christian tradition, it is prayer. In the East, it's called meditation, where the mind turns its attention away from its objective content and begins to trace its way back to its source. And that's really the essence of prayer or meditation, the sinking of the mind into the heart or the source of awareness, which is symbolized in this parable by the return of the son to the father. Now, that would be an example of a non-dual interpretation of a Christian parable.
I think you should do some lectures, much like Jordan Peterson has these biblical lectures, but yours taking a non-dualist perspective. That sounds extremely interesting, insightful as well. Okay, there's a couple notes I'm thinking of. I'll just say them. When it comes to prayer, you mentioned prayer to the West is what meditation is to the East. However, the way that I understand prayer in the West is that one is thinking of God as an object in a sense, and I'm praying to God. It's not the union with one and God is not the same as I'm becoming God. It's more like I'm going to allow God's will to shine through me. I still see a dichotomy. So I don't see prayer as being the same in the West. Sorry, I don't see the analogy as being exact between prayer in the West and meditation in the East. So please give me your non-dualist interpretation, just like you did for that parable.
Okay. I hope I used the phrase the essence of prayer when I referred to prayer, because you're right. Most of what goes under the name of prayer in the West is not what is considered to be meditation in the East, although there are also many types of meditation in the East, of course. But I would suggest that the essence of prayer, or the highest form of prayer, does equate to what is considered the highest form of meditation in the East, which is sometimes called self-inquiry or self-abidance, this sinking of the mind into the heart of awareness. So let me try and explain this. And I think I'll use the analogy of the dream to because I hope it will help. During the conversation we had a couple of days ago, Kurt, I mentioned the analogy of how the dreamer's mind imagines the dreamed world within itself and simultaneously localizes itself as the separate subject of experience, the dreamed character, from whose point of view it sees its own mind, the activity of its own mind, as the dreamed world. Now, the separate subject of experience, the dreamed character, of course, doesn't know this. It doesn't know that both itself and the world, which it considers to be a real world, are the activity of a dreamer's mind, which doesn't appear anywhere in the time and space that seem to be real from its point of view. So from the point of view of the dreamed character, the dreamed character considers itself to be a body inside which exists a mind. And it considers that the outside world is separate from itself and made out of something other than itself, namely matter. Now, the dream character, the apparently separate subject of experience, looks at this world and, of course, marvels at it. And almost all dreamed characters, separate selves or finite minds, look at the world and wonder, where did it come from? The world obviously gave birth to me, to my body, but the world must have appeared. It must have arisen out of something. And just as the world out of which my body emerged is greater than and outside of my body, so that which gave birth to the world must be even greater than and outside of the world. So that the dream character imagines that there is something beyond the world, beyond the universe, in fact, that is even greater than the universe and has such extraordinary miraculous powers that it can give birth to the universe. Now, the name it gives to that supernatural being is God. And God is, in this model, conceived as being at an infinite distance from the separate self and has to be approached through prayer, supplication, denial of self. And now that's it's a rather crude an analogy, but that's the basic model of dualistic prayer, the individual self at an infinite distance from a created God. And this distance, one could never really be united with this God. There would always be a distance, a sense of otherness. Now, when we wake up in the morning, when the dreamer wakes up, they realize, of course, that the creator of the world was not some supernatural being at an infinite distance from itself. Its own mind didn't create a world outside of itself. The dreamed world was the very activity of its own mind. In other words, what the dreamed character believed to be a creator God outside the dreamed world actually turned out to be the very activity of the dreamer's mind, which was the essence of the dreamed character. So from this point of view, in order to go back to the dream now, in order for the dreamer to access God, that is the reality of its universe, it has to go deep within itself. Going out into the world won't bring it any knowledge of that which creates the dreamed world. If it wants to find that which creates the dreamed world, namely the dreamer's mind, it must go deep into itself. It must investigate, what is my essential self? What is the nature of the knowing with which I know my experience? It's not my thoughts, not my feelings, my sensations, not my perceptions. And in that way, the dreamed character is tracing its way back to its essential, irreducible self, which is, of course, the dreamer's mind. So it turns out that the God that the dreamed character previously conceived at an infinite distance from itself now turns out to be its very own being. In fact, there is no being, there is no separate self, either to know God or not to know God. The separate self is a temporary and apparent limitation of God, that is, of the dreamer's mind. There's no question from this point of view of the separate self having a relationship with God. There is no separate self there, either to have a relationship or not to have a relationship with God. God, or infinite being, or infinite consciousness, is the only reality there is. And the separate self is an apparent limitation of that reality. So in that sense, to pray to God would mean to go deeply into one's own being. Well, that's self-inquiry. That's the essence of meditation in the East. So in that sense, what the essence of meditation in the East and the essence of prayer are exactly the same activity.
You also mentioned that when we're this finite being, we lack the infinite, or apparently lack the infinite, and it's in this that we feel a pull, we feel some suffering, and we think we can make this feeling go away by acquiring material possessions. But what we actually need to do is realize our unity with all. Okay. What I'm wondering. Okay, correct me.
Let me just rephrase
Sure.
that. Well, what we really need to do is trace our way back to our essential being, whose nature is peace and happiness.
I'm curious if the lack that we feel as finite creatures, or apparently finite creatures, is what produces some of the suffering, or if not all of the suffering.
Yes, it creates all the suffering. And by suffering, I mean psychological or emotional suffering. I'm not speaking of physical pain. Yes, it is, because psychological suffering is always, I don't like what is happening. It's like suffering is resistance. I'm not talking about not liking physical pain. That's something different. Take the experience of jealousy. One can be in good physical health and feel jealous. So when we say, let's put it like this: if you've if you told me the other day you stubbed your toe, you
Good memory.
and you said, you probably didn't formulate it like this, but you said, I don't like this experience. Now, when you say that, the I that you refer to in that case, or the thought, I don't like what is this experience, arises on behalf of your body. You're referring to the resistance of your body. It's an intelligent resistance in your body. When you say, I am jealous, the I does not refer to your body. Your body is not jealous. And now the presence of awareness is not jealous. Awareness is like an open, empty space. It can't resist. So what is the I? On whose behalf is our resistance or jealousy arising? It is on behalf of an I which, if investigated, is never found. It arises on behalf of an illusory separate self or ego. Or I would suggest, or the non-dual understanding suggests that all psychological or emotional suffering arises on behalf of a self which, when investigated, cannot be found as such. In other words, it arises on behalf of an illusory separate self or ego. And that is why the remedy for suffering in the non-dual traditions is not to try to alleviate one's suffering through the acquisition of object, substance, activity. It is to investigate the nature of oneself, because if one investigates the nature of oneself and one discovers that one isn't a temporary, finite, separate self or ego, but is this open, empty, spacious presence of awareness, then the suffering on whose behalf, the suffering that rose on behalf of a separate self, can no longer stand, because its protagonist, its basis, has been removed simply through understanding, through clear seeing, not because we have done anything to the separate self. There is no separate self to do anything to. The separate self is an illusion. You cannot get rid of an illusion because it's not really there in the first place. You can only see through it. So that is why this emphasis is placed on self-knowledge in this tradition. And indeed, in the West too, the words "know thyself" were carved above the entrance of the Temple of Apollo in Delphi, and as such, this suggestion to know oneself, this invitation to know oneself, stands at the very origin of Western civilization. It is not just an Eastern attitude.
When you think of this essence that is us, this awareness, do you happen to visualize it at all? Like an orb or an ocean? I know the metaphor of the ocean is frequently used, but I'm curious if you have a visualization of it or you just have a feeling of it.
I refer to it in visual terms when I'm trying to speak of it. Really, one cannot speak of it. One cannot describe it. It has no objective features. So in order to, well, not in order to describe it, but in order to try to evoke it in someone else's experience, we borrow language from our conventional discourse. We borrow language that is somehow evocative of its qualities. So we say, we use phrases such as the open, empty space of awareness. Well, awareness is not an open, empty space. It has no dimensions at all. But we cannot visualize or meaningfully speak of something with no dimensions unless it's going to be at a very abstract conceptual level. The purpose of the non-dual understanding is not to describe reality. It is not possible ever to describe reality accurately. The purpose of the non-dual teaching is to bring us in our experience to reality, to the experience of reality. So the non-dual teaching is a bit, Picasso expressed it beautifully when he said of art, all art tells a lie, but it points to the truth. Well, the non-dual understanding is like that. Nothing that is said in the non-dual teaching is true. If we want to speak about the truth, we should remain silent. However, remaining silent is not very effective for the vast majority of people to bring suffering to an end. Therefore, the non-dual, the sages of the non-dual tradition made a concession and spoke about the non-dual understanding and used analogies and metaphors and drawn from everyday life, not to try to describe reality, but to try to evoke the recognition of reality in us. And hence phrases like the luminous quality of awareness. We borrow that the sun is that which illuminates, the sun is that which renders the earth visible. Well, awareness is that which renders experience knowable. So awareness is sometimes likened to a light or a luminosity, only in the sense that it's a knowing light. It is that which enables us to know or experience.
Have you heard of Wittgenstein before?
Yes.
He had a concept of, or there's a famous phrase of what you cannot speak of precisely, one must pass over in silence. And that reminds me of that. He also had the ladder, Wittgenstein's ladder, if you heard of that, which is at the end of his Tractatus, I believe he said. And all of what I told you was just to bring you up the ladder for you to kick it away because it's meaningless. The whole point of this was to show you that words can't do this justice.
Exactly. Now, some people, having understood this, decide never to speak about it because they don't want to tarnish this understanding with words. And I respect that. It's not the approach I take, and it's not the approach that many others take. I'm willing to make concessions, to use words as carefully and accurately as I can, knowing that nothing I say is absolutely true, but hoping that they have at least some power to evoke in the listener the experience from which they come.
Getting back to this lack, because there's a riddle. Speaking of Jordan Peterson, he's the one where I heard this riddle from. The riddle is, what does an infinite being with infinite power, infinite knowledge, and so on lack? And then you think, well, it can't lack anything because it's infinite, but it turns out it lacks finitude. It lacks finiteness. So in the same way, what I'm wondering, in the same way that our apparently finite self lacks the infinite and experiences some suffering, does the infinite lack the finite and the infinite experiences some suffering?
apart from a sort of, as a sort of semantic game, I don't know how one can meaningfully speak of the infinite lacking the finite. The infinite has no knowledge of the finite by definition. If something finite existed in the infinite, it would displace a part of the infinite. And therefore the infinite would no longer be infinite. It too would be finite. So the infinite knows nothing of the finite, and there is no question of the infinite lacking the finite. That's just a semantic game. It doesn't relate to anything that is true. There is no question of the infinite lacking the finite. Nor indeed is it really true to say that the finite lacks the infinite, because all there is to the finite is the infinite. All there is to the dreamed character is the dreamer's mind. The dreamed character in this analogy is the finite. The dreamer's mind is the infinite. So we cannot say that the finite lacks the infinite, because that would credit the finite with an existence of its own. In the absence of the infinite, it would be like saying the dreamed character existed in its own right, independent of the dreamer's mind, and therefore lacked the dreamer's mind. But this is not so. The dreamed character is simply an apparent limitation or localization of the dreamer's mind. In other words, all there is to the dreamed character is the dreamer's mind. Likewise, all there is to the apparent finite is the infinite. In fact, there is nothing finite in existence. There are finite appearances. The finite only exists at the level of appearances. But what is all appearances have a reality. They are an appearance of something. The movie you see on your screen, the movie you watch is an appearance of something. It is an appearance of the screen. And the screen shares none of the limited qualities of the movie. It is colorless. The movie is full of colors. Likewise, the finite only exists at the level of appearances. The reality of those appearances is the infinite. And this is what is meant in the Bhagavad Gita, where it says, that which is never ceases to be, and that which is not never comes into existence. By which it means the infinite never ceases to be, the finite never even comes into existence. The finite is only real from the illusory perspective of the finite. The ego is only an ego from the illusory perspective of the ego.
How long does it usually take people from when you explain these ideas to them, and let's say there's someone off the street, not much of a meditative background, but they're a contemplative person, how long does it usually take before they feel the insight, not just intellectually understand, but feel the insights that you're conveying?
You know, Kurt, simply by virtue of the fact that all apparently separate selves or egos are, as we've just said, the infinite, albeit a localization of it. For this reason, everybody, not just those of us that are philosophically or spiritually minded, but everybody has deep within them some intuition of what we are speaking of here. Now, that intuition is veiled in varying degrees, depending on the opacity of their thoughts and feelings. Or some people's thoughts and feelings are so dense and opaque that there's only a glimmer of this knowledge or recognition filters through into their life. But even such people that we would, for instance, consider to be truly evil, such people are capable of love. Hitler had a girlfriend. Presumably he loved her. He experienced love. In spite of the fact that the density of his thoughts and feelings only enabled a glimmer of love to shine through and a light on just one or two people. But everybody has within them this knowledge or this understanding. So to answer your question, or to respond to your question, how long does it take people? It I can't answer that question, because some people can explore these matters. People have come to my meetings and retreats that have been on this path for 40 years, 50 years. And so that they have been, their minds have been prepared. And very often, because of the maturity and the subtlety of their mind, they very quickly, it's just that there was a little piece missing that just needed to be added. And oh, yes, of course, that's it. However, I've also had, and it very often happens with very young people, I've had teenagers come. In fact, I had an 11-year-old boy once who came to one of my retreats in California, and he asked me a question. He's now in his late teens. He asked me a question, and stupidly and naively, I thought, okay, I must water down my answer and give a child's answer. So I gave a rather childish response to what I thought was a childish question, and then he proceeded to. Then he said, "Is this what you mean?" And then he summarized the previous 3 days of the retreat extremely eloquently in about 3 or 4 minutes. And I realized that I had been wrong to presume that just because he was young and relatively unsophisticated in his ideas and had never been exposed or had not long been exposed to these ideas, I was wrong to think that he would somehow not be able to understand. On the contrary, his mind was so fresh and clear and unencumbered, not only by his own conventional cultural conditioning, but also by the spiritual and religious conditioning that so many of us had to go through. That of course, in some ways helped, but in other ways obscured the simplicity of this understanding. That this enabled him to very simply understand in his own experience what was being said. So I can't really answer your question. It varies. But I'll just say one other thing, Kurt. I think it's only recently, certainly it took me many, many years. And when I look back and I wonder, why did it take me 30 years to recognize what is so clear and obvious for me now? Well, maybe it was because partly due to the opacity of my own mind, I'm quite sure it was, but it was also because these ideas, in the way that I first received them, and I went to India, not physically, but intellectually, because these ideas were packaged in a way that was not clear. The packaging, it was packaged in a form. It was an Indian packaging that somehow obscured to me the real contents. And a lot of the spiritual traditions, much of the knowledge that we hear from those traditions is nothing to do with the essential understanding. It has everything to do with the culture in which the understanding arose and was expressed, and is actually superfluous to the understanding itself. And I think it is only relatively recently that this understanding is being expressed, divested of all the religious and spiritual paraphernalia in which it has been enshrined and I would say very often disguised until recently. So I think this understanding is much more available now than it was even 10 years ago, and available in a way that doesn't require anyone to subscribe to any to a person, a guru, a teacher, a tradition, a religion. Or it's just the raw essential understanding is being expressed in just in everyday language without recourse to the Tibetan language or the Sanskrit or all of these. Much as I love those and respect those traditions, I was brought up in the Vedantic tradition, but the association with the cultures in which those traditions arose tend to exoticize. I'm not sure that's a proper word, is it? They exoticize the understanding and make it seem like something extraordinary and mystical and from a lot of people's perspective, a little woo-woo, to be honest. The recognition that is being spoken of is nothing extraordinary. It is just the recognition of the nature of one's own being. There's nothing, even the taste of tea is extraordinary compared to the recognition of the nature of our being. Sorry, that was rather a long answer to your question.
Okay, the question comes from DIY Craft Q. Can Rupert Spira discuss the death transition that Rupert Sheldrake thinks is like moving into a dream state, but I think Spira believes our memories disappear into the greater consciousness, and then he puts in brackets, which pretty much sucks. What's the point of all of this individual real or not identity simply to blend and mush with the consciousness blob? He means that respectfully.
Yes.
I don't know if you're aware of Rupert
Sheldrake.
Sheldrake.
Yes, I know Rupert. He's a friend of mine. Yes. Let's go back to the dream analogy. The dreamer imagines the dreamed world within its own mind, localizes itself within its own dream as an apparently separate subject of experience, from whose perspective it views its own activity as the outside world. So the outside world is what the activity of the dreamer's mind looks like from a localized perspective within that world. Yeah. The body of the dreamed character is what the localization of infinite consciousness looks like from a second person point of view. So translate that to our experience in the waking state. Each of us are localizations of infinite consciousness, and our bodies are what that localized consciousness looks like, how it appears from the outside, just as the universe is how the unlocalized activity of consciousness appears from a second person point of view. So bearing that in mind, that the death or dissolution of the body would be the relaxation of the localization or contraction of the finite mind or separate self. The finite mind or separate self could be considered a localization or contraction of infinite consciousness, which appears as each of our bodies. Then death would be the decontraction, the relaxation, the expansion of this segment of mind that is the separate self back out into the broader medium of mind which gave rise to it in the first place. Now, There's nothing to suggest that this contraction of infinite consciousness into the form of the finite mind expands on death all the way back to infinite consciousness. There is nothing to suggest that it could not begin to disintegrate, and this would correspond with the death of the physical body, but the individual mind could remain in some form still within the universal field of consciousness without dispersing completely into it. And that is what I believe, although I've never heard it from him or discussed it with him, but I think that this would be what Rupert Sheldrake meant when he said that it's like entering into a dream state. It's just as in our experience in a dream, our mind expands beyond its limitations in the waking state. In the dream state, our mind relaxes, and much of the content which was not available to our mind in the waking state becomes available to our mind in the dream state, simply because our mind has relaxed and expanded, and what was previously what's called subconscious, outside the compass of the waking state mind, now appears inside it. So this is Rupert Sheldrake's analogy of the dream state to death. As the finite mind expands on death, it begins to lose its limitations. It begins to experience regions of the universal mind that lay outside its experience while it was alive, but is now encompassed within it because it has expanded, just as our mind expands in the dream state. And in the Tibetan tradition, this is called a bardo. It is considered to be a realm. It's not really a realm. It's not an extraordinary realm that we go to. It is always, everything is always within the only realm there is, infinite consciousness. But it is, as the mind expands, we have more access to the content of infinite consciousness. And from the localized perspective of a separate self, we conceive of that as a realm that we go to after death. We don't go anywhere after death. We consciousness stay exactly where we are, but we cease contracting ourselves, and we expand. But as I said, there's nothing to suggest that expansion goes all the way. It may remain, and there's nothing to suggest that it could not
coalesce back.
That it could not coalesce again and appear in this realm as a physical body.
Interesting.
So I just leave that open as a possibility. It would be an interpretation of reincarnation that was consistent with the understanding that reality is a single, infinite, and indivisible whole whose nature is consciousness. So it would be a more sophisticated interpretation of reincarnation. It's not really that we as individuals are born again and again and again. That's a rather, it's a rather there's some truth in it, but it's mixed with a materialistic understanding. It's a kind of, it's a traditional idea. It's also a New Age idea, and like a lot of New Age ideas, there's a kernel of truth in the idea, but it has been appropriated by the ego and mixed with its conventional materialistic perspective, and some hybrid idea, in this case, idea of reincarnation, has resulted from it.
Where can the audience find out more about you, and what are you working on next, Rupert?
Okay, so the easiest place to go is YouTube. I have an embarrassing number of YouTube clips. So that would be one way to get a quick, easy, free sample. My YouTube channel, Rupert Spira. I have quite an extensive website. If you are interested in the more philosophical aspects of this conversation, I would recommend one of my books called The Nature of Consciousness. If you're interested in the more experiential aspect of this conversation, I would go to my book called Being Aware of Being Aware, which is a much smaller, very experiential, direct exploration of the nature of consciousness. Whereas the book, The Nature of Consciousness, is more philosophical, and so those are the two books I would recommend. What am I working on now? I've just finished writing a book now, which I did during lockdown. It's called You Are the Happiness You Seek, which is an attempt to try to make this understanding available to people, to the people that we referred to before, not just the scientists who are put off by the nonsense in the New Age community, but who don't want to subscribe to any religious or spiritual traditions or teachers or ideas or customs, or who just want just want the raw truth about how to find happiness. And so it's an attempt to first of all explain how happiness is the very nature of our being, and then provide simple pathways of accessing it without any religious or spiritual paraphernalia. So that book is about happiness itself. As I suggested, The Nature of Consciousness is more philosophical. It's about what we've been speaking, and Being Aware of Being Aware is more experiential. So any of those sources, take your pick.
And do you have a Twitter or a Facebook page? Or Ruth will send me all the marketing material.
I do have a Twitter or a Facebook page. I have to confess, I literally can't remember when I last looked at either of them. I don't really do Twitter or Facebook. Ruth and a small team of people deal with all of that and update it. And so yes, Ruth will give you all the links to Facebook and Twitter and yeah.
Thank you so much, Rupert. There are more questions, but you're probably itching to get going, and I appreciate that you've stayed for as long as you have.
Not at all, Gerd. And I really mean, it's been a pleasure speaking with you. I've thoroughly enjoyed the conversation, and you've made me say things that I wasn't aware were inside me. So it's a beautiful conversation, and I'd be more than happy to. Perhaps we should pause now. We've said an awful lot. I'm sure you need to pause too, and we could resume as and when.
Great,
if
thank
you would
you
like
so
to,
much.
I'd be very happy to.